Our final speaker of the session is Smitha Milli, a research scientist at Meta Fair in the AI and Society group. They received their BS and PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from UC Berkeley, where they were supported by an NSF graduate research fellowship and an open philanthropy AI fellowship. Their research focuses on pluralistic alignment, that is, ensuring that machine learning systems are effective for and inclusive of people who hold diverse and differing viewpoints. Their work has been discussed in live television, in policy outlets such as Tech Policy Press and the Knight First Amendment Institute, and in testimony to the House Financial Services Committee. Here is Smitha Milli with the talk titled Dynamic Preferences in AI Alignment, a Deliberative Democracy Lens.
Cool, thank you, JP. Sorry. I'll try to keep it punchy since I know it's just before lunch. So for my talk today, I want to talk about first a problem in AI alignment that has bothered me for like a very long time. Then I want to talk about how I think that deliberative democracy can actually inspire us with a solution to this problem. And finally, I'll talk about how we've taken this deliberative democracy-inspired approach in some of our recent work. So first, let me talk about what the problem of dynamic preferences in AI alignment is. To do so, I need to first define AI alignment. So this definition is not a prescriptive one, it's a descriptive one. I think most people, when they use the phrase AI alignment, they mean something along the lines of aligning AI systems to the preferences, values, or goals of humans. In general, I would say there's two paradigms for thinking about aligning a system to different people's preferences, which you've just touched on. Either we have a personalized paradigm, where we have a model that personalizes to different individuals, or we're in an aggregative paradigm, where we have one model that is interacting with many people at once, and so needs to be aligned to an aggregation of different people's preferences. But in general, what alignment procedures do is, based upon some given human preferences, they try to ensure that a model outputs an appropriate response, generally. What we don't usually account for is that this model output may also change people's preferences, right? This feedback loop is rarely accounted for when we either evaluate or enforce alignment. And I want to argue that it may be the most important part. So let me give two examples. So when people are interacting with a chatbot, we might evaluate that chatbot by asking the users whether they prefer its outputs compared to another model. But the real question might be, over long-term usage with that chatbot, does it change that person's opinions in ways that are harmful to themselves or other people? Okay. I'll give another example. When we think about a recommender system, we might evaluate that recommender system by giving user satisfaction surveys and asking the user whether they're satisfied with what they are shown. But again, the real question might be, do these algorithms over the long run increase polarization or not? So when we come back to this definition of AI alignment, I think this problem of dynamic preferences really raises an existential question here for alignment. Because if the goal is to align to people's preferences, then the question is, like, which preferences? If preferences are a moving target, and in fact the system can change people's preferences in the future, what do we do? So I'm going to kind of simplify. There have been proposals in AI alignment for what to do here, but I basically think any proposal that focuses only on people's preferences runs into various pitfalls. I'm going to simplify it a little bit and explain what I think the core tension is. Core tension is, if we just optimize for people's preferences right now, this ignores the impact that the system might have on the person's future preferences. So to give you an example, even a recommender system that's just trained to optimize engagement right now might have long-term outcomes, but we're not modeling or taking that into account. Okay, on the other hand, so if optimizing for now isn't good, the next thing you might think of is, well, let's optimize for people's preferences in the future. So optimize for what somebody's preference is going to be in a month or in a year. Problem with this is, A, it's infeasible over long horizons. We have complex system dynamics, and these long horizons might be where this matters the most. And B, this leads to explicit incentives for the system to manipulate your preferences. So let me give a really silly example, which is, let's say we have a recommender system that's trying to optimize your preferences like a month from now, and it's trained via RL on people's past preferences. Somehow it learns that people who are Taylor Swift fans are really easy to satisfy. Like, you just show them a video of Taylor Swift and they're happy. So it somehow learns this policy of trying to show people videos of Taylor Swift to make them Swifties so that eventually they're happy. So this is a silly example, but you can imagine this kind of reward hacking happening. Okay, so for a long time I was kind of stuck with this problem because it seems like neither of these solutions, optimizing for people's preferences just now and ignoring the impact, or optimizing for people's future preferences, was a great solution. Recently, in the past few years, I've gotten pretty excited by deliberative democracy, and I think that this field can actually inspire us with a solution to this problem. For context, in the past few decades, work in democracy theory has really moved from aggregative notions of democracy, where legitimacy comes from aggregation of people's preferences, for example, in intermittent elections, to deliberative notions of democracy, where legitimacy comes not only from aggregation of people's preferences, but also through the discussion and deliberation that people form preferences through. So I think deliberative democracy is cool because, unlike fields like CS or econ, where preferences are usually modeled as being static, in deliberative democracy, preferences have always been inherently dynamic, because there's no point in discussing with people if preferences and opinions can't change. So to make it concrete, let me give an example of what a lot of empirical work in deliberative democracy looks like. People will bring in representative samples of the population in for a deliberation, like in a citizens' assembly or deliberative poll, and it's pretty much assumed that people's post-deliberation preferences are going to differ from their pre-deliberation preferences. To bring this closer to the AI context, I want to bring in a third party here, which is the facilitator. Okay, what should the facilitator in a deliberation be doing? Something they're definitely not doing is thinking, should I optimize for these people's pre or post preferences? Mostly they're thinking, let me make this a good deliberation. What does it mean to have a good deliberation? Scholars in deliberative democracy have come up with a lot of ideals that are pretty reasonable, like generally there should be civility and respect, information should generally be true, should be comprehensive, people with different viewpoints should be represented, etc. And so the facilitator is generally trying to make conditions like this come true. And of course, they might take into account people's preferences when doing so. For example, if one group has viewpoints that haven't been represented yet, they might ask that group to speak up, etc. But I think we could kind of summarize what the facilitator is doing here by this idea. They're really creating an environment where any future change in preferences has legitimacy and agency. If these conditions that I showed you are met, we're basically ready to accept any way people change their preferences after that. On the other hand, if these conditions were not met, for example, there was a lot of misinformation during the deliberation or the facilitator was biased, then we don't really see the way people change their preferences as being legitimate. We wouldn't trust that. This is also really, I think, intimately tied to agency. If the deliberation has these good conditions, we're essentially trying to give everybody the information they need to make the most informed decision about their opinion. But ultimately, people have agency in what opinion they have. The facilitator's not trying to manipulate their preferences to go in any certain direction. Okay, so finally, you probably know where I'm going with this. I think we can basically think of machine learning models as being like facilitators. And we should think also about this goal with machine learning models, where we are trying to create an environment where any future change that people have in preferences has legitimacy and agency, and we can actually trust this change. How do we create this environment? Well, we will have to draw from the social sciences to think about what these conditions are. So to move on to make this more concrete, let me give you a couple of examples of where we've taken an approach inspired by this in our recent work. So I'm going to try to give two examples if I have time, but one of them is going to be in this kind of aggregative paradigm, the other is going to be in the personalized paradigm, and they're both going to be in the sort of recommender system social media case. Okay, so looking to this aggregative paradigm, so far I've talked about how deliberation, like empirical work and deliberative democracy often works in these formal environments like citizens' assemblies, but actually most deliberation is really happening in informal environments. And more often, this deliberation has really moved online to the online public sphere. So in a recent paper, unfortunately not uploaded yet, but if you email me, I can send you a copy, we tried to actually look at how we can facilitate online spaces to satisfy these kinds of deliberative ideals. Obviously, we'll never get totally there, but we can try. So in this paper, we specifically focused on unpersonalized rankings online. So for example, the comment sections that you see on news sites or on social media. And our question, super concretely now, was, given M comments, what set of K, much less than M comments, should be highlighted, like appear at the top? And here we want to really focus on creating a good deliberative environment. So what should we do? As I said, you know, in this case, it's very clear how this fits back to the deliberation analogy. Now we just have this ML facilitator of this online environment. So what kind of environmental conditions should we be thinking about? Here we really turn to this literature in deliberative democracy to think about the ideals people have talked about. Some of these ideals are really about the style and content of the conversation, like the conversation should generally be civil, arguments should be supported, etc. And actually, people are already trying to target these attributes when ranking comments online. So of course, for a long time, people have been using things like civility and toxicity classifiers, but also more recently, people are also creating, this is from Perspective API in particular, creating classifiers for attributes like reasoning and nuance, etc. The other type of ideal I would say is unrelated to style or content, and it's more about representation. So for example, the idea that all points of view held by significant portions of the population should receive attention. This is kind of independent of how things are stated. So ultimately, what we end up doing is framing this as a constrained optimization problem, where we're trying to maximize some score function of the comments that we select. So this is related to the style and content of the conversation, civility and nuance, but also such that these set of comments satisfy some representation criterion. So we have a constraint that different viewpoints are represented. And overall, we think that this will create a good deliberative environment. What is this representation constraint? I don't really want to get into the details, but it is a representation constraint from social choice that, importantly, does not use something like predefined groups or demographic labels. What the justified representation constraint ensures is, given some data on which users approve certain comments, we will ensure that basically all groups that are large enough and have some minimum cohesion in their preferences receive some representation in the set. But without getting into the details, something I want to kind of highlight is like, what do we gain here by focusing on this overall deliberative environment? So social choice is often used in this kind of aggregative democracy setting. For example, most of these methods are created with the election context in mind, where the focus is only on preferences. Because, I mean, in an election, you wouldn't want something completely exogenous like civility to make a difference. But I want to argue that in the AI context, we might be having an election like every minute. And so it's important to consider the system's kind of accumulative effects and externalities on the deliberative environment. And so that's what caused us to frame it in this kind of constrained optimization. And I think this also leads to some new theoretical and empirical questions in social choice. So for example, to what extent can you optimize this kind of exogenous measure with this representation constraint? So we actually show that in some natural settings where people's preferences exhibit some clustering, you can actually achieve high representation and also these exogenous measures of civility, nuance, etc. Okay, but mainly what I want to highlight here is that going back to this goal of creating an environment where future change in preferences has legitimacy and agency, what we did here was really focus on how we want the overall deliberative environment to be. And the social choice part was absolutely important, but only one part of it. And framing it this way also led to some new questions. Okay, so second example I want to give is in the personalized setting. This is basically, the personalized analog to the aggregative setting I told you earlier. Is another place we see a lot of informal deliberation happening is obviously on social media through your personalized timelines. So of course, when we have personalization, we have to account for people's current preferences to show relevant content. And one approach that we've been taking here to still curate a good environment is understanding how the formalization of someone's preference, for example, whether we formalize preference based on someone's stated preference, what they say, or their revealed preference, what they do or what they interact with, affects the overall environment. So we did this study a few years back where we actually recruited about 800 Twitter users. We showed them tweets from people they followed, and we asked them whether they wanted to see this tweet or not. And so we compared then ranking by their stated preferences of which tweets they wanted to see and ranking by their revealed preferences, just what they engage with. We found that ranking by their stated preferences led to less hostile, emotionally charged, polarizing content. So, of course, more research is needed, but that suggested to us that you can actually improve the overall environment by creating more affordances for stated preferences on these platforms. The first thing you're probably thinking is, why would these companies have any incentive to optimize for stated preferences? The story is more complex than that. So in a paper that was led by Jonathan Stray and some other folks, we actually talk about how companies already optimize these kinds of non-engagement signals to some extent and can see benefits through it. So mainly the point I want to make is it's not an either or, but we're far from the Pareto frontier for businesses and society, and we can get better. But to do that, we actually have to solve some technical problems first. It's actually very hard to optimize for stated preferences on these platforms because these signals are very sparse. So about 5 years ago, when I was working at Twitter, like interning during my PhD, we actually created some methods to basically extract more from these kinds of user controls you see, like a see less often button. But you're always inherently limited by the kind of sparsity of these signals. And now we can just tell the recommender system what we want, hypothetically. So in recent work, this is led by Micah Carroll, we've created a method where you can basically specify in natural language your preferences and have this modify your recommendations in an efficient way. So here's a screenshot from a demo of that, where you can put in like any kind of text preference you want. This one is a kind of silly one, which is like, movies set in inclement weather. And as you kind of increase the weight on stated preferences, it goes from the person's normal recommendations to like movies that take place during volcanic eruptions. So this paper's not totally out yet, but it will be, and the demo will be soon, but you can also email me if you want a copy. So anyway, but bringing it back to the big picture, we had this idea that we can improve the environment overall by creating more affordances for stated preferences. This also then led to a new kind of research directions about how we actually do that. So just to highlight again, even when we optimize for preferences, we can think about creating a good environment overall. I think it's really important to not abstract this environment away. Okay, so to conclude, I've said many times now that I think this goal should be to, our goal with our model should be to create an environment where any future change in preferences has legitimacy and agency. So the obvious questions that arise here are like, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions on the environment that we should be aiming for? So this talk in particular was focused a lot on deliberative democracy, which I think is very useful when thinking through these problems. But of course, there's other fields that are very relevant as well. And then the second question is, how do we formalize these conditions and achieve them in AI contexts? A lot of my talk focused here on recommender systems, but I think these questions are just as important for language models, especially as they become more agentic and more personalized. And that's some ongoing work that we are continuing as well. But different techniques will be needed, and we need more research. Okay, so thank you so much. And I just want to call out, I couldn't put all my collaborators on here, but I want to call out Manon Revel, who I worked in close collaboration with on the first project in the aggregative setting, and also Micah Carroll, who I've worked with a lot on the second line of work, and is also very freshly on the job market, and I would highly recommend hiring. Okay, thank you.
All right, we have ample time for questions.
See if someone can correct my flawed logic. So, thank you very much. Wonderful. I want to kind of connect all three of you maybe. So build on Smitha and connect with Vincent, because we started with the moral choice, which I think presumes moral agents. And the moral agents of our discourse today have been AIs. However, I'd like to propose that at least currently, the moral agents known to us are the people here in the room. And so let me see if I can put this in a metaphor and if it would make any sense. In a way, technology is a magnifying mirror. It is a mirror because it reflects who we are collectively and individually. It reflects our dreams and desires and our fears, the best and the worst of us. But it is magnifying because it has this amplification, magnification, unpredictable acceleration effect. And so if we're exclusively focusing on technical solutions, it's kind of like polishing the mirror and complaining about the image we see in the mirror. At least to some extent, perhaps, we need to shift the focus to the moral agents, because the question is, can flawed or even immoral agents create other moral agents, and how? And so instead of perhaps focusing on just the AIs, should we not be talking a little bit more about us, and instead of creating better AI, how can we cultivate better humans? Because we have this kind of disproportionate investment, trillions of dollars into AI, very little into humanity. It's like having two children, and Hans Moravec said, AI are our mind children, but if you have two children and you put all your money in investment and education into one child and totally ignore the other, and right now humanity is kind of the abandoned child, then the outcome is kind of predictable. And that loops back to moral choice. And that, by the way, loops back to control.
Excuse me, is this a question?
Yeah.
Can we get to the question,
the
please?
The control is, do we need moral agents? Are we not the moral agents, and do we need not better humans to make better moral choices rather than just moral machines who would take it over for us and do our job?
I can take a stab, but I think that's one of the reasons that I'm actually very excited about deliberative democracy is through deliberation, people can come to more informed preferences, they can come to consensus, reflect on their opinions, etc. And so I think it's important that when we create our models, we actually leave affordances for that kind of deliberation and agency and preferences. But yeah, if anybody else wants to.
So I'll second that. I think deliberation is useful also for ourselves to learn more about the relevant space and hopefully become better moral reasoners ourselves. So usually it's good to have something concrete to talk about. So I think, yeah, for that purpose, it's good. We have talked a little bit about also, you know, how do you create maybe AI systems that are kind of a moral compass to ourselves, rather than just making decisions based on our preferences, coming back to us and saying, well, you know, in general, you stated this kind of preference, but then your revealed preference is such and so, right? As Smitha was talking about. What gives? Do you maybe want to revise what you're doing here, or maybe you didn't actually state your general goals accurately? So I think there are possibilities here to help human beings become better moral reasoners as well. But I agree that could use more investment probably as well.
So this might come across as a terminological quibble. I don't mean it to come across that way, but it's about this word preferences and what is changing, for example, what is changing during one of these deliberative democracy meetings. And so the word preference in some literatures means, for example, what policy do you prefer? In other literatures, it means what future do you prefer? And it's sort of the theoretical economics bit more towards the second, social choice voting, it's a bit more towards the first. And I think often in discussions about social media, it's more this, what policy do you prefer? My guess is that in deliberative democracy, what's changing is not which future people prefer. They come in preferring a future where people are not dying of starvation, and they leave preferring that future. What changes is their belief about which policy will bring about or avoid that future. But it seems to me we have to distinguish between changes in your beliefs about the functioning of the universe and changes in which future you actually want to bring about. And I'm just wondering do you make that separation, and how do you think about the issues in those two cases?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This is back to this like classic economic modeling of your preferences don't change, but your beliefs do, or you can even model like rational addiction and things like that. I feel like, yeah, this has been something I haven't been totally sure about for a long time as well. I kind of feel like it comes down to computationally how we end up modeling preferences in AI, like what will be most useful for the most useful abstraction. Because if you model preferences as never changing, but it only being belief updates, it's just the question is like, can we efficiently model things that way? Is kind of where I start to think.
I'm not saying that preferences in the sense of what future you prefer are fixed. It's
Okay,
just
yeah.
that changing them is a different thing from changing someone's beliefs.
Definitely. I think that I agree with you that I think most of the times people aren't changing their like most core values. But I think that I think the points about creating a good environment, will still hold regardless of exactly what preference is changing. And so to me, the exactly what type of preference is changing seems more like a modeling question. But I think, does that make sense? I don't know.
Okay. I mean, it seems to me it's legitimate for an AI system to change people's beliefs by presenting evidence and saying, look, if you do this, people will die of starvation, and here's the evidence, and so on. As opposed, but is it legitimate for AI systems to deliberately change people's preferences about which future comes about? Like,
Yeah.
convincing them to prefer a future where they are enslaved, for example, would that be okay?
I guess for that, so my point is that we shouldn't optimize just directly for people's future preferences, because you can get into weird reward hacking issues there. But of course, I do agree that the AI system can present relevant knowledge. It's kind of similar to what Vince was saying about like, oh, you seem to have this inconsistency in preferences, how do we resolve it? And to me, that qualifies more as the environment, like creating an environment where the person has all the relevant information and like, some inaccuracies they have are corrected, is still creating a good environment. So that to me is okay. Yeah.
From Joseph's talk this morning, he talked about like the invisible hand. So how do you think the big tech would be incentivized to perform deliberative democracy? How would we push for this sort of benefit?
Okay, it's funny you mentioned that because Meta actually does do deliberations, and Andreas Katsanevas, who's right there, has been pretty instrumental in setting those up. So I would recommend talking to him after. But basically, Meta actually brings in representative samples, asks them things about AI. This is in collaboration with the Stanford Deliberative Democracy Center, and then they actually measure people's change in preferences around things like personalization of AI chatbots. So I think people are, like, we've seen basically every major like AI lab experiment with some amount of deliberation in the recent years.
I have a follow-up question to Stuart's, which is, if you're trying to align something consistent with people's dynamic preferences, you talked about making that consistent with any future preferences. Why do you choose any future preferences? Shouldn't you be choosing their possible future preferences? And that surely becomes then a psychological problem of understanding how people's preferences do change, because they don't change in completely arbitrary ways.
I guess my point, I'm not sure what you meant by consistency there, my point was if we create conditions that we think are like conditions where people have all the information they need, etc., then if we give somebody, if we're willing to accept somebody's agency and their own preference change, we're ready to accept any preference they came at after being in this conducive environment, because they basically had the best possible conditions to form their opinion. And we see that as being legitimate because all the conditions were there. So the reason that I say any preference change is basically to preserve this kind of agency.
Hi, thank you. So I'm coming from a philosophy perspective here, and I'm glad you invoked this idea of legitimacy and agency, and I really appreciate this approach to deliberative democracy. But I don't think, I mean, if you're going to invoke these ideas about legitimacy, then I don't think social choice theory is adequate, because satisfying people's preferences, to me, there's no theory of legitimacy in which satisfying preferences justifies the decision. What we need is some way of aggregating or having a democratic process that expresses our united will or our collective autonomy. That's what creates legitimacy. And we have a tradition that does this, and it's political philosophy and the law. And so, I mean, I think the law is one place for the social choice theorists that they ought to be looking for, perhaps for norms to constrain and guide AI systems. I mean, we started off with a prompt about copyright, and there's no discussion about that. That's clearly a legitimate restriction on what the machine should be outputting, right? Because it's gone through a legal system that has legitimacy, that has some process, democratic process, to extract a collectively autonomous choice, and therefore can be used to constrain and guide outputs. So I'm just wondering if, because once you invoke deliberative democracy and legitimacy and agency and stuff like that, then you're talking about something other than preferences. You're talking about willing, autonomous willing, which is not the same thing. It's just a preference. So.
Yeah, thanks for your question. So that's actually exactly my point, is that preferences aren't enough. So this is why my point is that we need to focus on the deliberative environment in which people form these preferences, like this free will formation, et cetera, and have these AI systems create an environment where that kind of formation can take place. And preferences are like one part of this, but I think I'm trying to emphasize that exactly this point, that preferences are not enough. And so I think social choice is absolutely important, but it's a part of a larger picture. So I think I agree with you, but I'd love to talk more later.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
Yeah. So just to jump in on this point between like social choice theory and maybe broader democratic theory, I personally tend to have a very expansive view of social choice, or what it could be. I think I agree with you that for now it's still somewhat narrow, and we don't capture all the different things that are part of our broader political process and that are important as well. I think a good thing about social choice theory, I think this is a good thing, is that it is often mathematically very precise. And I think that is very helpful in these kinds of contexts where we actually want to implement things in code. That said, we don't know how to implement everything that we have in our broader democracy in code. I would be in favor of let's try to expand what we can reasonably do. But whether you, I will take the point that, you know, for now, social choice theory misses a number of things that are important.
Thanks. Question for all of them, and then so kind of a follow-up on what you asked, even though I wanted to, thanks for that one as well. So, as I'm sure you know, social choice doesn't exist in isolation. So social choice theory starts with an existing model saying, here is the list of options, what do you prefer, right? And in addition to that, we have our own, somebody who created that list of options, so there is someone who knows what there is to want. And then there is perhaps also second-order preferences, like there are desires or preferences that I have, but there is something that I want, right? I want to want the healthy vegan option, but I end up wanting the burger. So my question to you is, there existed a deliberative democracy, if you like, that created the mathematical model of the social choice. Can we see a future in which there exists the mathematical model of social choice for moral behavior of machines that creates the deliberative democracy and social infrastructure that ensures that the options that ended up being chosen from are all there is to want, are legitimately generated, as it were? So, speculative question. Is this a role for social choice? This is for all of you.
I'm sure others can speak to this as well, but I think there are a lot of people experimenting with ways to choose those options in participatory ways. Like, for example, systems like Polis and Remesh, where people, you know, contribute their own options and then people vote on the options that other people have contributed, etc. I think it's an interesting vision you're proposing at the end, to have these systems create more deliberative approaches to even setting up the problem. And I think we're increasingly seeing methods that are actually working in recent years.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's also important for us not to get confused about what is doing what, right? But I think, as Smitha said before, a lot more of our deliberation is taking place online. And so there will, and there already are, algorithms that govern that kind of interaction, right? And algorithms tend to be precise and mathematical. So whatever we call it, we have to think about what those processes look like. Maybe we want to think about having fail-safes as well, and maybe it's good. I like the picture of the people in the bar talking with each other, and maybe we don't want to lose all of that either, right? But given that algorithms are already so important in our deliberative processes, we need to have methods for thinking precisely about how we want to specify those in a way that leads to good deliberation and human flourishing more generally.
All right, unfortunately we are at time, so if you'll all please join me in a final round of applause for our speakers.